Okay. I want to just thank International Clinics for having us here. It's been a pleasure so far. A lot of good questions so far, so hopefully the same thing today. I represent Avicenna AI. My name is Michael Marx. I'm from Boston. We're also a French company. We're out of southern France, just about 20 minutes east of Marseille. So we're a CT emergency radiology AI company. We look to optimize the workflow. We detect different types of pathology that are very urgent, where time is of the essence. We also quantify with some applications, much like Yassine with Gleamer was just explaining. They do some measurements on the bones. We do have some applications that look at CT and generate measurements very quickly for you, so you're not annotating too much. We also have other applications that instead of detection or quantification are more focused on screening, incidental findings, looking at exams for maybe the pathology that it is not ordered for. And we'll get into more detail, of course. We're a very regulated company as a medical device company. We have tons of images. We do everything on the cloud. Our training systems are very advanced. So a lot of times when it comes to fine-tuning the algorithm or going into validation, and we have to maybe do small training sets to improve the algorithm a little bit, we actually can do it by hand. So it allows us to use the human eye and kind of teach the AI what to detect, what not to detect. And then, of course, we do validation studies and have to get it approved with the FDA. So we're ISO certified, so we're very security compliant. We do business with a lot of big companies, so they require us to have all of these kinds of certifications. BSIs, European auditing, and also MDSAP. So between all of these different organizations, we work with them to make sure that we're compliant with all the standards across the globe. So this is our emergency radiology leadership portfolio. And I'll just go across from left to right. First, we have CINA ICH. When we were founded in 2018, only 5 years ago, the CINA ICH was our first product. It is a triage tool, so it will give you a prioritization in your work list, and it also gives you a little region of interest around the area of the suspected bleed. Now, if the bleed is multiple slices, we're going to actually have a series here, so you'll be able to scroll through the secondary capture and see all the areas of the bleed. If you disagree, that's okay, you can over-report it. So automatic detection and prioritization there. Then we have suspected LVO for CINA LVO application. It's also a triage tool. What we're projecting here is a 10 millimeter maximum intensity projection, and we put a little bounding box just around the area of the suspected occlusion. Automatic detection and prioritization of our ischemic strokes. These are on CTA exams. These are on non-contrast CT exams, as you could probably assume. We also have a quantification tool for non-contrast CT in CINA Aspects. So CINA Aspect, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Aspects. I think not every hospital uses Aspect scoring because it's time intensive. Usually the radiologist has to make these little segmented territories in their mind and compare the left and the right hemisphere for hypodensity. This is a very hard thing to reproduce from one radiologist to the next radiologist. In some studies that we did with 3 neuroradiologists, we found that they actually almost didn't agree very much. It was below 50% that they have the same score from 1 to 10. One says 8, one says 7, one says 6. So it's very hard to reproduce this kind of quantification, and it's time consuming. Now imagine if you have a patient in the scanner with a tilted head or has dementia and is moving. You're not going to have symmetry of the brain either. So it's very difficult for a radiologist to look at symmetrical parts of the brain when the temporal lobe is on a different slice on the right side than on the left side. So another thing we do with CINA Aspects is we normalize the brain and we retilt it. So you actually have, if you would like to, you can look at the original CT, which is rebalanced, and also the midline is normalized with the sagittal sinus. So it's very nice to have the ability to report from scratch. And then you also have a superimposed territory map with probability areas in red. We look for sulcal effacement, and we also look for areas of hypodensity. So between the two, we find a percentage of likelihood that the area is becoming ischemic. This kind of quantification tool works on non-contrast CT from after 100 minutes after the stroke onset up until 12 hours. We have to give the 100 minutes for change to happen, and then we can start to detect these changes without contrast. Sometimes this kind of an exam, if you have a negative ICH on non-contrast, but you see that there are big ischemic changes, you can then order the contrast for this patient. In some cases, this will help the patient's outcome. We also have vascular solutions for emergency vascular. Here's pulmonary embolism. So we're looking at chest CT pulmonary angiograms on this particular algorithm. On aortic dissection, we're looking at chest vascular exams. We can look any exam that contains the aorta. We can assess for a false lumen and the aortic flap here that you see created. On both of these applications, we do have a little bounding box on there, and they also do prioritize in the work list. So if you go to lunch and you have a nice lunch outside to take a break for an hour, get some fresh air, and you come back, you have 100 cases waiting for you. You know which 5 ICH cases, which 2 LVO cases, which 3 PE cases, and which 2 AD cases you need to open first when you have a list of so many others. We also have incidental findings portfolio. This is something we just started to develop more. Our first priority was emergency radiology for CT. But these are a little more focused on non-emergent cases. Now you might ask, what's the difference between an incidental pulmonary embolism and pulmonary embolism in terms of AI? Well, it's the same pathology, but when a patient comes in with shortness of breath or is disoriented, you may be already starting to think, we need to look at the lungs. We need to do a CTPA, right? There's other cases where the patient has adrenal cancer and they're in the scanner getting contrast, but it's aortic, it's through the aorta. They're not really looking at the lungs. This is an exam that's not geared to look at shortness of breath. It's just a patient that is sick. They're on a lot of medication. Sometimes it's painkillers, and it actually reduces their respiratory rate or can hide the respiratory symptoms a little better. And so on this type of a case, let's say this is an abdominal exam looking at the kidneys, but you still have an area of lower lobes of the lungs. And what this application is able to do is look at the partial view of the lungs and analyze quickly for any pulmonary embolisms that maybe are not the focus of the radiologist who is busy, who's getting calls, who has to go to fluoro, who has to go to ultrasound, gets back. This is just that extra added level of security so that you can analyze these cases where your attention maybe is not. And the reason we developed this is one of our neuroradiologists at University of California, Irvine said, this is very important because these are the ones that I miss. So that's why we started to develop this. It's a really popular product. We just released it actually at ECR 2023 only a month and a half ago. We also have CINA VCF, and CINA you might think it's short for Avicenna, but it actually stands for Comprehensive Integrated, meaning technically integrated into your workflow, neural networks approach. So that's what that stands for, just to clear up any confusion. This is our out of the US output. And basically what we're doing with VCF is we're also looking for incidental findings. Of course, if you order a spine screen for the patient and you're looking at their spine because they're walking funny, they have left leg weakness, let's say. You're already looking at the spine. That's not what we're targeting here. What we want to look for on these kinds of exams are pelvic exams, abdominal exams, maybe exams where you don't have the cervical spine, so it's difficult to count. It takes extra time. You have to locate the 12th rib just to figure out where you are in the exam. This application will look at a partial of the spine and be able to generate height loss values for each vertebrae. How does it do that? It looks at the vertebrae above and the vertebrae below and then gives you a height loss value based on the relative height loss of that vertebrae. We also give a Hounsfield unit number of the mid-slice of the vertebrae that is most affected. In this case, it's T12. It's 39.4% of a height loss with an average Hounsfield unit of 66.2. The goal is to speed this up for you guys so you don't have to constantly be measuring vertebrae or finding the mid-slice. And now, there's also, for the US, we're going for more of a triage tool just because the differences between the FDA and CE marking, they're very different. So in the US, this will look more like a secondary capture without all this information in a commercial environment. Of course, if you want to do research in the US and whatnot, you can have access to all of these kinds of tools because it's not as regulated with research mode. And I think for Chile, you actually may have access to everything that's an out of the US product, which is very nice because there's more information on them. Now, how does this look? How do all these applications look in the workflow? Now, I know you all probably use different PACS systems depending on which hospitals you're working at. This is our CINA Compose platform by Avicenna. It can be on the cloud, or it can be installed through a VPN on-premise, if that's what you would prefer. Sometimes data sharing and privacy is an issue, so on-premise is a better option. The goal of this platform is to upload DICOM cases, and you can actually see, and I uploaded these very recently just to show you, just a couple days ago. We have Mastermind, which is going to detect what kind of exam. Is it brain? Is it chest? Is it something else? Maybe it's rejected if it doesn't fit any of our applications. Mastermind will determine which applications are going to run on the exam. And then we're going to see a suspected finding in orange. We'll see blue. We'll see that it says negative for suspected findings. And red if there is a rejection or the case cannot process, there's some reason that is a problem. Just to quickly go over the icon functions, I'm just trying to give you an idea of how this looks and how this feels. We have upload DICOM. We have refresh the study list and log out. Very simple. Try not to overcomplicate things. We also have a drop-down menu here. If you click this little down arrow, you get all the DICOM information. Of course, this is an anonymized patient. The MRN is not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And just to see how it looks when we want to identify a case and we upload the DICOM, first we'll see Mastermind thinking. There will be a little circular loading right here. And while Mastermind is deciding what to do with the exam, it will be just loading like this. And once we move into the analysis process, we'll see Mastermind choose the algorithms that it's going to analyze. So in this case, it's LVO and incidental pulmonary embolism. So that tells me this must have been a head and neck exam because we must have some apex of the lungs, a partial of the lungs, right? LVO is, of course, the focus here, but it is nice to have IPE running in the background for you. Of course, it's not very common to have clots in the apex, more of lower lobes, I think. But still, it is a nice safety net. Results, positive, negative, rejected. So I explained that blue, negative, orange, positive, red, rejected. We see it here, it says application in progress if you hover your mouse over the button. And then once it's rejected, we can actually hover the mouse and we see this pop up and it'll tell us exactly why it was rejected. So for our aspects algorithm, you need to have a slice thickness greater than or equal to 2.5 millimeters, okay? Each application has specific specs that you need to follow in the protocol. They're all general manufacturer protocols, so none of these deviate from the normal. However, some sites use specific protocols for one reason or another. Maybe they do low dose and they use a lower KVP than the other general sites in the world. And that's okay, but to have the AI work, sometimes these things need to be tweaked a little bit. Maybe you need to raise the KVP by 10 to have better quality results from the AI. 120 KVP, for example, is what we recommend for all of our applications to work perfectly. So Here's an example of a case, CT head brain without contrast. Mastermind sends it to ICH for intracranial hemorrhage and aspects for analysis. And now we might be wondering, well, if there's an aspect score for ischemic change, how can we also have a bleed? And that's a great question. These two applications are working on the same exam, but obviously the more important issue is the intracranial hemorrhage that's going on. So we can disregard the ischemic results here, because if there's a bleed, it's going to negatively affect the accuracy of our ischemic algorithm. So here we have warning, hyperdensity detected, meaning if you see this little pop-up as a radiologist, you can say, okay, maybe I should look at the ICH result before making any decisions on the ischemia. This is how we make these two work together so that you don't see this result and think, oh, they have an aspect score of 7, they need TPA. And I'll just keep moving along. Just wanted to show you how they can work on the same exam. So for CT angiogram of the head, we have a negative incidental pulmonary embolism in the apex of the lungs, but we do have a positive LVO. Here we have the left middle cerebral arteries. Patient has right-sided weakness. And you can see if you click into the exam, it'll have a little red exclamation point. Open the exam because there's a suspected large vessel occlusion, and then there you have it. All you have to do is confirm the finding and get that patient to the OR, unless it's been too long, in which case they still need to be managed. We also have an aspect score here of, I'm going to show you 2 different aspect scores. So there's a head without contrast. There was no bleed in this case. I think ICH was over here. I just didn't include it. So here we have ischemic changes. We have the left hemisphere, which is seeing more ischemic changes. These are all Hounsfield units. And what we do for every brain is we find like a normalization of the Hounsfield unit value. Some people have thick skulls. Some people have thinner skulls. It's just humans. And so once we normalize what the Hounsfield units are, we find the outliers, things that are deviating from that normal. Okay? Now, if we have orange on the other side, the less affected hemisphere, it's still of interest. Of course, you can really, hypothetically speaking, you can have one clot at a time that causes a problem. You go to the hospital, you're having a clot. However, the reason you had a clot is unknown. Maybe you had an unhealthy birthday dinner, you celebrate too hard and didn't take your medication, whatever it is. And you have some stenosis on the opposite side in your carotid that's causing some ischemia on the opposite, less affected side than where you're having an actual clot. So this is all non-contrast, but in this case, you would probably want to say, oh, let's get some contrast for this patient and see where this clot is. So again, a quantification tool, but at the same time can lead downstream to more exams that are going to benefit the patient's outcome in the end. Here we have an aspect score of 8, no ICH found. But what's nice about the aspect score of 8 is aspects is used to determine if to give TPA or to hold TPA, and if to give thrombectomy or to not give thrombectomy. Sometimes the patient is too far along in the disease process where, or the stroke, the ischemic stroke process, where doing surgery isn't necessarily going to benefit them anymore. So sometimes too low of an aspect score means we need to manage this patient without surgery, without TPA. In this case, aspect score 7 or greater means give TPA and hold off on surgery. So this would be a reason where a radiologist would see aspect score of 8 and say, okay, let's give TPA for this patient. Of course, this is just an assistive device. Ultimately, it's up to you. It's your patient. And then we have down here negative ICH. It just says no finding suggestive of ICH identified. Here we have pulmonary embolism for a CT angio of the chest. And because it's of the chest, incidental pulmonary embolism did process it and finds the same exact result as pulmonary embolism. However, this has more. Timing? Yeah, that's something that actually sets us apart from some other AI companies. Our processing time is very fast. So there's actually quite a few intracranial hemorrhage solutions out there in the world today. However, the way that they process is different. As Francisco was mentioning, we have machine learning, and then we have deep learning. Deep learning is like putting 3 machine learning chains together and then pooling all 3 of their results. So which 3 machine learnings do you make your deep learning with is different for one ICH and another ICH. Some companies get the image and they just tilt it back to be oriented and centered and not tilted, so the patient's head isn't tilted. Some reslice the exam. Some break down the matrix and make the resolution different. And I think that's where we actually gain a lot of speed. So we require a 512 by 512 resolution, but when our AI receives the data, we transform the 512 by 512 matrix into a 256 by 256 matrix, which reduces the data load by 4 times. So it's a 1/4 of the data load. And we're able to then normalize for artifact by converging these voxels. We're able to normalize for motion a little bit, because now we have a bigger voxel. And then we also have a quicker processing time, because now that we've condensed the matrix, we have less data to work with, and it's easier to work with it. So instead of 2 minutes, like a lot of our competitors, we're processing these in 22 seconds, 35 seconds. Nobody's faster. And it's partly because of the way that we're processing the data. And unless somebody wants to rebuild it from scratch, I don't know if they're going to be able to touch those numbers. We also have other steps of the process, 2 other, let's call it, 2 other legs of machine learning before we pool all the results. But I'll leave those for intellectual property.
It's like a quick report.
Yeah.
Un informe en 30 segundos. Con un escáner es una cosa espectacular. O sea, que encima te diga, listo, te das un barrido rápido y te dice, enfóquese en esto. O si no te prioriza, que es lo más importante. Hay centros de delegación que reciben muchos escáneres de distintas partes de Chile y la verdad es que no saben si sí, si no, alguna precisión clínica. En cambio esto te hace un escáner, te hace una revisión rápida y te los prioriza. Y te pone, no sé, te llegaron 50 escáneres en el día o en la mañana. Esto te lo revisa y te pone arriba los 3 o 4 que realmente es muy evidente que hay hallazgos de que hay que tomar decisiones rápidas. Entonces, eso es.
I think I'd like to say something about the integration. I heard a question earlier, and I kind of bit my tongue. I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about it. All of these applications are very simple. I mean, we deliver them as a Docker, so it's a nice, small, light file. It can be integrated with any system. The way that the integration works depends on the current system of the hospital. For example, if your hospital system uses email notification, that's okay. Is it Gmail? Is it a different email, Microsoft Outlook? Those use different application programming interfaces, but we know how to program with each one. So we can route the result from our Docker to whichever email service you use, whichever IP address for PACS you use. We can route it to 7 PACS systems if you have 7 locations. We can route it to the scanner, back to the scanner. If you only want to view, say for litigation purposes, you don't feel comfortable having this result in your browser. And you only want it on the scanner, but never to be sent to the PACS. We can configure it that way. I've seen that. It's rare. I think you'd want it in your PACS so you can work quickly and not walk over, unless you really like the technologists and you want to go talk to them all the time. But there's a lot of different options for integration. I just want to make that very clear. You can do HL7, HTTP, HTTPS. It all works. And yeah, as you can see with the businesses we integrate with, it's always different. And yeah.
Super.
Any other? Yeah.
Right on time.
Good. Perfect. Gracias. From English.